My name is John Fairfax. I am a great-great-grandson of the original John Fairfax, who came to Sydney in 1838. He came from Warwick in the United Kingdom. He left school actually at the age of 12 and went to be an apprentice with a printer in Warwick. And that's where his love of newspapers, if you like, and printing began. Well, he went down to London to work on the Chronicle, and he spent 12 months in London doing that, and then came back to Warwickshire and worked on the Leamington Chronicle and Warwickshire Reporter, which was the paper that he eventually owned. The evolution of the Sydney Morning Herald started with a rather unpleasant situation where, with his paper in Leamington, was sued for defamation. He had to defend it, and it cost him a lot of money, and he was bankrupted. So John Fairfax decided that he needed to get out of town, so to speak, and try his life somewhere else. So it was a courageous thing that he did to take his young wife and 3 children on the Lady Fitzherbert to Australia. When John Fairfax arrived in Sydney, I understand he had 12 sovereigns in his pocket, but it would have been about £1 each, I think. And that was all he had until he was able to gain a further £5 when he became second in a guessing competition as to when the ship would eventually arrive in Sydney. So when he arrived in Australia, his first job was to become the librarian for the Subscription Library, which was the precursor to the State Library of New South Wales. He then teamed up with Charles Kemp to ultimately buy what started off as the Sydney Herald, and that was in 1841, and it was converted to the Sydney Morning Herald. Eventually, Kemp decided that he'd done enough and they'd worked well together, and he thought that John should take the business on his own. The change of name from the Sydney Herald to the Sydney Morning Herald, I think he was wanting to stamp his own identity on the publication. John Fairfax was very much a family man. Right from an early age, he was religious. He went to church frequently. In fact, one of the interesting aspects was that when he got to run the Sydney Morning Herald, he would not accept advertisements on Sundays for religious reasons other than funeral and death notices. He was adamant about impartiality and fairness not just to the news that was reported, but fairness to his workers too. He was considered a very, very fair employer. Indeed, he saw journalism and newspaper publishing as a sacred trust. And so the paper was extremely ethical, and its news coverage was balanced. As the paper became a little more popular and they needed more copies, they couldn't rely on the original Columbian press, which was a hand-driven press, printing sort of next to no copies in an hour. So they did import the first steam-driven Cowper press to Australia in 1853, and that produced 3,000 copies a day. John was an extremely honourable man. He didn't forget the fact that he left England bankrupt, and after the paper was a little more prosperous, coinciding with the gold rush, he returned to England in 1852 with his wife, and he sat around a table with a little black book that had a list of his debtors, and he repaid all of those, and the letters he received from those people after repaying them gave him one of the greatest satisfactions of his life. John's eldest son, Charles, was a treasure to John and a treasure to the organisation. In 1863, when riding a horse, it bolted He was thrown and he died 2 days later. The tragic death of Charles had a huge impact on John, and I think he was never the same person again after that sad occurrence. John died in 1877, which was 2 years after his wife Sarah died in 1875. John Fairfax was a really noble newspaperman. He was described in many ways as a dedicated religious person with ulterior motives to benefit what ultimately was Australia and particularly the colony of New South Wales. But he was an outstanding individual, and I'm very proud to have had him as a relative.